And I'll be honest, there is absolutely nothing here that is really original. So, a little while back, I did a video on what the lit RPG genre was all about, specifically by taking a look at what has now become one of my favorite book series that I've read this year, Dungeon Crawler Carl. Now, I read the first book for that video, but then in the subsequent days, I ended up reading all 6 of the ones that were out at the time, and I did it in the span of 20 days, which was not great for productivity and made me realize something as I was going through this. I couldn't put the books down. It was some combination of the plot and the characters and the systems and the levels and the progression and the loot and the gear and the stakes, everything just consistently ramping up that made me realize, like, wow, yes, hey, this is a great series, but there is something going on with the lit RPG genre that I need to look into a little bit more. Because I went online, I went on the subreddit, I took a look around. This is not an uncommon experience. It really feels like people who sort of dip their toe into the water just get absolutely pulled under. They jump into the deep end when it comes to the genre. And that made me want to take a look and think about it a little bit more. What makes lit RPG so addicting? What is it about the genre that just sucks people in? Now, I'm someone who's worked in the video game industry for almost a decade. I helped launch a video game, something that I am pretty familiar with when it comes to things like, well, game mechanics and what makes games so compelling. And that's something that I want to talk about here, all through the lens of He Who Fights with Monsters by Shirtaloon or Travis Deverell. And because, like a lot of these other books, a lot of the things, these are books and series that have been written in sequence over a long period of time as a serial, both on places like Patreon and Royal Road. This is where lit RPG lives. People constantly pumping out, new content week after week, month after month for years. So how do you keep that up? How do you continue to make it compelling? And how do you keep people coming back for more? Let's talk about it. So He Who Fights with Monsters is my second book that I've ever read, or second series in the lit RPG genre, which I'm going to keep saying awkwardly through the whole video, and you're just going to have to deal with it. Lit RPG genre is hard to say, all right? I'm just going to throw it out there. And it follows the one and only Jason Asano, who, in very much a true to style isekai format, he wakes up reincarnated in another world. He is naked in a hedge maze being chased by cannibals, and he has no idea how he got there. And similar to a lot of stories in this isekai sort of subsection of lit RPG, he has some very familiar game mechanics to work with. Now, he has things like an inventory and a basic sort of character sheet. He's got items that he can equip and unequip, and he can inspect and analyze different pieces of gear, his loot, and sort of how he's interacting with the world. He has things like cooldowns, a health bar, a mana bar, obviously things that are maybe not unique to him, but unique in sort of how he interacts with the world. Now, like I said, he wakes up not in a very good position. In fact, in a very precarious one. He's being chased by cannibals. He has no idea what's going on. Literally, 1 second he's asleep in his bed, and the next moment he wakes up butt naked in a field. So it's like, okay, how do I deal with this? Well, he doesn't really deal with it super well. He ends up getting captured, meeting a couple of other adventurers, and ends out, a little bit of spoilers, breaking out and sort of tagging along with this party, who are quite a few ranks above him. They are, in fact, bronze rank. And these ranks are extremely important to the story, because while you sort of start out at normal, progressing through these ranks and the things you need to do to get from one to the next are, I would say, the most quintessential element of this system. This one is, I think, a little bit less hard than some systems in that you don't have like strength, dex, whiz, that kind of stuff, the standard sort of archetype from things like Dungeons and Dragons. There's also not like a set amount of XP that you get from killing monsters, as an example, or mobs or minions, other people. It's very much more a softer system in terms of leveling things up, though there are still hard percentages. What attributes to those hard percentages is a little bit more amorphous. And it follows Jason as he meets a series of these other characters, and they sort of take him under his wing and teach him what it means to be an adventurer, because that's really the backbone of what this story is all about. Now, having read this first one, it's about Jason basically setting himself up to become an adventurer in this world where, yeah, people fight monsters. Very akin to, if you've played it, Monster Hunter, which I feel like has to have been a very strong inspiration for this particular story. While again, Dungeon Crawler Carl follows a lot of like more classic D&D archetypes, this story I feel follows a lot more of those like anime video game traits a little bit more. You go to the notice board, you're given a quest, you go out, you kill monsters, you get stuff from them, you bring it home, like, and you get rewarded for it from like the guild basically. And that's the loop in all this. And that's where I'm going to touch on again the idea of the core, well, we would call it a gameplay loop in the video game industry, but the core loop of the story is you go out, you are faced with a task or a challenge, one that we don't necessarily think the protagonist or group of protagonists, in this case, as we sort of build up a party around Jason, can necessarily overcome. Something occurs, new abilities are used in compelling and exciting ways. Someone realizes, hey, I can do something I didn't do before. You actually have real true like anime level up moments. People can actually like evolve their skills, and they overcome a really impossible challenge or battle, and they're set themselves up for for success. They get a great loot, yeah, cheer, huzzah, and you get to go back and do it again. They use these things called essences, which are sort of the building blocks of the magic system in this. You get 4 main essences, 3 that you can sort of choose, and then another one that sort of is created random based on, well, not quite random, based on the ones that you've chosen. So, going through these essences and sort of how you level up your individual skills from there is super important, because you only get 4 and then 20 skills or abilities on top of that, which is really cool. Now, there are definitely some harder limitations to this system, and I think having it on those rails a little bit more is great, but I do think that Shirtaloon did a really good job of giving himself room to sort of grow and flex as he needed to by being able to evolve things like racial stats, etc. But coming back to that loop, I think really at the end of the day, that's what creates that super compelling dopamine hit. Is this, again, if you've played a video game, you go out, you complete a quest, you get the experience, you ding, you level up, you get this new piece of gear, and it feels amazing. You go on to the next zone, you go on to the next quest. This is a tried and true formula in the video game genre that is really not being explored in too many other places other than in progression fantasy. And it's so interesting to see how, the things that I think maybe we take for granted in video games are really, grown upon here, expounded upon here. And I think what's super cool about it as well is this idea that every single part of this story feels familiar. And I'll be honest, there is absolutely nothing here that is really original. But it doesn't have to be. And that's the amazing part about it. The familiarity is what sells it. You have a sense of sort of how these character archetypes are supposed to fit together. You have a sense of how the world is supposed to work. You have a sense of how these fights are supposed to go. But it's still rewarding when you get there at the end. And when moments are subverted, they're fun and rewarding because you're like, oh no, like somebody messed up. Like we're actually gonna have some more challenges here. And I think this particular book does a really good job of blending the moments where you get the victories you're supposed to get, but also punches you in the gut a little bit, sort of when the moment happens. And I'll talk a little bit more about the book in depth. Again, it follows Jason. He's really acclimatizing to this new world, and he ends up getting, candidly, some pretty messed up powers. He ends up developing this build that essentially is A, extremely uncommon, B, very disconcerting, and C, really only useful in a couple of key situations, but in those key situations, he's essentially a god. Now, in certain situations, against certain opponents, thinking about that, if you've played enough video games, you're thinking, okay, like there's definitely some applications for this, taking down big, bad, scary monsters, but what about like a horde of tiny mobs or all this? How does other stuff work? And that's really where I think this book does a fantastic job, especially right at the start, of sort of setting up his limitations and sort of how he looks to overcome those. And it's really interesting to sort of watch his progression through, because he starts off absolutely, truly at the lowest rung. He really starts off in a bad spot, and watching him sort of work through and overcome it, again, very classic, like training montage style, is super cool. And what's also interesting about Jason, and I think sort of the best part about him and the worst, I think is truly his character. He is a very off-putting person to a lot of people, like endearing and kind, but I do think that maybe some heavy-handedness, like I love, hey, a good, power to the people, rallying cry monologue down with, the capitalist overlords, like, hey, I'm all for that. But at the same time, I think it becomes it almost becomes a meme. It almost becomes a joke. And again, there's like 10 of these books at this point. I've only read the first one. So I'm really curious to see how far that sort of continues in the story, if he sort of matures a little bit, because he's only 23 when this story starts, which I think is sort of a really interesting, like from like a story standpoint, like new adult would sit from 19 to 21. And then so it's technically adult, but he's still right at that age where he kind of feels not like a kid, but definitely a little bit more immature in some ways. And I do think that the way that dialogue is phrased and structured, it's a little Sorkin-esque in the sense that's like, we all wish we could talk like this, but I don't think there's any world that exists where he really would talk like this, especially because he sounds like he's kind of an outcast and a loner back on Earth before he gets isekai'd to this other world. And so this idea that he's suddenly this like incredibly smooth talking, over the top, confident person is, I don't know, a little bit interesting. Again, put in the face of death, facing down these things that should be impossible. There's suddenly in this world of magic, and suddenly you're in the midst of it, and you have all these magical abilities and powers, and you have people who can jump and fly and teleport and all this other kind of stuff. And you're like, well, I guess I'm in it. Maybe you'd have that reaction as well. But that's sort of the one thing that stood out to me a little bit, alongside the fact that the author likes to do a lot of sort of small head hopping or small POV hops, which is not something I'm personally a huge fan of. I think it was relatively tastefully done in this case, and I do like the idea that there's sort of these like cheeky cutaways and asides where we sort of see other people's reactions to what Jason is doing, because those are just like fun. And I think that's just, at the end of the day, part of what makes this so addicting. It's not only the loop, it's just that it's legitimately fun. It's fun and familiar. Like you want to see your guy getting like, wow, Loki, that guy's Loki a badass. What the hell? That's so cool. Like you want to see him get hyped up by his allies and his enemies. You want to see people scared of him. You want to see people root for him because you're doing it as well. And I do think those small moments, when done tastefully, were good. And I do think overall this was a solid read. I already bought the second one. Definitely gonna, fit it into my reading schedule for sure. Because again, at the end of the day, if you are a fan of, well, games like Monster Hunter, if you're a fan of these traditional systems, if you're a fan of LitRPG, this one seemed to be very popular, but also somewhat polarizing. There was definitely a camp of people who seemed like you didn't necessarily like this one. The overall prose for this particular story was fine. Again, it's quick, it's serialized. I definitely noticed, though, in the back half of the book that there were a lot of like things that were repeated and repeated and repeated, like almost verbatim text blocks. Like you could tell this was like an end of a section, and he like needed to remind everyone about the stakes, so he like rephrased it again. And you're like, you said that like 50 pages ago. Like, what's going on? And then of course you have to remember, how a lot of these books are sort of formatted and set up. And again, this is not at all uncommon for people who are reading, week to week on a platform like Royal Road. But yeah, in the end, again, I think really, and my girlfriend made a comment about this, and I can't even be mad about it because she's not wrong. She's like, look, these are like the cheap, quick romance books for dudes. Yeah, they kind of are. Like you just get the good stuff. You just go in, you meet a badass character, they face adversity, they overcome it, they level up, they become more badass. People look up to them and respect them. They climb the ranks, they're going from a normal adventurer to an iron tier. They want to make it to bronze, all the way up to diamond. Can they make it? The stakes get higher, the world gets bigger, you expand. Like every single thing about this, if you are someone who's a fan of fantasy and video games, this just scratches every perfect itch. And I totally get why this series is so addictive. And I totally get why people binge it like they do. And honestly, I'm glad I'm only discovering it now. Because if I had found this years ago, if I was following along week to week, man, it would be tough. I'm so glad that there are series that have thousands and thousands of pages already written, ready to be enjoyed. And LitRPG is definitely something I'm going to profile more on the channel. There have been a lot of other great YouTube channels here that have done it. Like Nerd Book Review is a great one. He's been doing a ton of stuff in LitRPG over the last while. So there's been a lot of great channels here that have covered it. I'm not going to say I'm going to do it a ton, but it is something I'm going to try and profile more because I do feel like it is a genre on the rise. I do think the success, again, of things like Dungeon Crawler Carl are only going to continue. I'm excited to see what happens when the TV show comes out and the overall interest in the genre spikes. So yeah, why is LitRPG so addictive? At the end of the day, it emulates what we all know and love from amazing gameplay loops. It inspires characters and worlds that feel familiar. It provides us with magic systems and things that are tangible, that we can sink our teeth into and understand. And at the end of the day, it allows us to feel like we are growing alongside the characters and progressing on this incredible journey to the point of taking over the world. And all those things combined make for some pretty awesome reading. And I really enjoyed that in this book. I don't think this was quite a 5-star read for me, quite as much as Dungeon Crawler Carl. I would put this in around a 4-star. I still really liked He Who Fights with Monsters. I'm someone who's played an okay amount of Monster Hunter. I am abysmal at it, my God. But, I definitely do see the parallels. I like the overall format and system. And again, I can totally envision this world and sort of, how these characters are going about it. And I'm excited to keep reading it. Again, if you all enjoyed this video, if you want to see more content like this, be sure to like and subscribe. I've been having a ton of fun reading books across a bunch of different genres of late, but we're going to have a ton more fantasy, especially coming down the pipe. So definitely keep an eye out for that. Appreciate y'all, and stay safe out there. I'll see you next time. Cheers.